So welcome, parents of the class of 2026. I was saying earlier, I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it, how time passes by. So thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Sarah Gleason-Ross. This is my 7th year at Gilman. I can't believe that either. I came here after a long career in counseling, college admissions. And from the moment I arrived on this campus, I have not ceased to be impressed or amazed by our remarkable students and talented faculty. And over the past few weeks, we've been meeting with the juniors for the first time. They will be my 8th class of Gilman students, and once again, they do not disappoint. This is a community made up of engaged and curious students with a wide array of interests and strengths, and it's just such a great honor to be a part of this community. So I wanted to start with our mission statement. Applying to college is an extension of the Gilman educational experience, a journey of reflection, growth, self-empowerment, and discovery. The College Counseling Office seeks to provide students with the tools, information, and support necessary to identify their goals and pursue them with confidence. It is our goal to help each young man find his best fit by identifying colleges where he will flourish intellectually, socially, and emotionally, both in and outside the classroom. During Tuesday's junior seminar, we had the privilege of hosting Andrew Zavasco, who is the Dean of Admission at Loyola University here in Baltimore. We've been bringing in deans throughout the week to talk to the juniors about, they can ask us any question they want about how college admissions work. And Andrew shared that at a recent reception for accepted students, Loyola's president, Terrence Sawyer, encouraged prospective students to view their college journey as a transformational one rather than a transactional one. This perspective resonated with me as we believe in the transformational power of the Gilman and college application experiences. So we are so fortunate to have such a gifted counseling team, and yet another reason I'm very proud to work here. And I've asked if they would each introduce themselves to you. So if we start alphabetically, Mr. Baker.
Morning. I'm Justin Baker. This is my 16th year at the Gilman School. I teach 2 sections of senior English. I'm also the JV baseball coach and the proud father of 2 boys in the lower school. Nice to meet you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Follensby, Associate Director of College Counseling. This is my 11th year at Gilman. Prior to Gilman, I spent 9 years working in college admissions at 3 different liberal arts colleges on the East Coast. Like Justin and Matt, I'm the parent of a lower schooler. I have a 2nd grade at Gilman. I also am an advisor. Sarah and I teach the seminar program, so we had the chance to actually see your boys last year as 9th graders, and we'll have 2 cycles with them as sophomores in, I think, April, before the end of the year. I coach in the intramural program. I oversee the senior encounter program. So if any of you have had older boys who've gone through Gilman, that's the 2-week-long internship that boys do at the end of their senior year. And new this year, I'm a service learning coordinator for the upper school. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Herman. This is year number 14 for me, and I know that number because my son was born and got me out of new teacher orientation. So I take his age and add 1. So I will remember that one. So that's easy for me. Other things that I do, I teach 2 sections of historical fiction, which are senior elective classes. I've taught U.S. history, I've coached JV soccer, and I am the current coach of the JV golf team. I also work with scheduling, and I advise. And so I also have 2 sons, one in lower school in 4th grade, and my other one in 7th grade. So excited to get to know your boys and work with them. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Scott, and I am the office manager for the College Counseling Office. This is actually my 5th year here, and I also do a lot of the standardized testing for the upper school. And I have a 6-month-old son who is not quite ready for college counseling yet.
So before we get to our main event of our guest speaker, I just wanted to quickly review the timeline for this year. So as you know, we have another program in April with Phil Pine from Capital Educators, who will review kind of the standardized testing landscape, which is very interesting right now. As Anna mentioned, we will be meeting with the sophomores in their sophomore seminar later in this year. And you already know about the college tour that takes place following graduation. This year they're going south. And then in August, Capital Educators will offer a summer test prep class here on campus. And next fall, there will be probably over 100 college reps will come to visit Gilman, and your sons will be invited to attend those visits. And this is a great opportunity for them to kind of dip their toe in the water and start to explore a different range of schools right here in school. The fall will be the PSAT. This is the PSAT that where the National Merit Scholars are selected. We recommend they take their first SAT or ACT that winter. I forgot to put in here, we also offer, so we have the PSAT, which is the practice SAT, and we also will offer with Capital Educators a mock ACT. So they'll have the chance to maybe see which one is their best match. In January, we'll launch with a program. We'll have, this year we had a case study program. We partnered with Bryn Mawr and Roland Park and had 21 admission deans here to do a mock application process, which was a very, very successful evening. We start meeting with juniors in the January of their junior year. We're also meeting, as I mentioned, we have a seminar for juniors. We have, I think, 6 classes or now 6 classes with them to kind of start reviewing the college process. Right now we're in the midst of helping the rising seniors schedule their senior classes. January to March is a great time to start to really research and visit colleges, spring break. I know we want to have vacation, also athletic things, but it's also another great time to visit colleges. The college tour next year will be heading north, and of course summer is the time to visit more colleges. We offer an essay workshop in June, and we offer another one in August. So what should your sons be doing right now? We've been telling them from the time they started at school to work hard in school and do their best and to challenge themselves to the best of their ability. This is the time for them to really start to explore and kind of things beyond the curriculum. You know, colleges really want to see, you know, how kids live out their life of the mind outside of the classroom, and reading, I know, is kind of something that a lot of kids aren't doing as much anymore, which I do think the phone might be responsible for that. But reading for pleasure is a wonderful thing for them to do, and independent projects in areas of interest. This is a time to explore and join new clubs and try out new things. And of course, service is, you can never go wrong with serving other people. But there's no right or wrong list, and I'm sure Nick will talk about that, you know, when he talks to you. And really, we want to prioritize wellness. I think before I was chatting with some parents, you know, Gilman is a very intense environment and a lot of aspirational students. So, you know, we really want to help them. That's a life skill that's so important to find balance in their life. And then when they're ready, this is a time to just kind of gently start to research colleges in a kind of more of a casual kind of way. Maybe take them to visit we're so lucky to be here in Baltimore City with Johns Hopkins and Loyola right here, Goucher, Towson, Maryland, and kind of get a feel for all the different kinds of schools that are out there. And of course now, one good thing about COVID is every school has virtual tours, so that's a great thing. And so, again, how can you support your son promoting his health? I think it's very tempting to want to talk to our children about college, but I think if you can resist that urge, this will all unfold very, very naturally. And we really want to encourage our students to be the driver in this process, for them to be the advocate for their future. And now we're in the time where we also want them to expand their scope. I think we have many kids who maybe came home wrapped in a UNC blanket, and from the time they were born, they've dreamed of going to UNC, and their bedroom is painted blue. But you know, now is the time to really help them understand that there are many, many wonderful schools out there. Financial aid is increasingly becoming a concern. I think Northeastern is $89,000 right now. So it's time to have open and honest conversations about affordability. And you know that we've partnered with College Money Method, and those resources they will be linked here, and I will share this slide deck with you, are on our website as well. But this is an amazing program. I encourage you to take advantage of it, whether you think you're going to apply for aid or not. He's a really knowledgeable guy. We love The Truth About College Admission, written by our friends Rick Clark and Brennan Barnard. Rick is he has a new title, but he's at Georgia Tech. He's now been promoted, but he was the director of admission. I don't remember his new title. And Brennan's a very experienced college counselor. And we also love the FISC guide. It's our favorite guide. So I would consider purchasing those two resources. And as I said, consider visiting a college or two, check out virtual tours. And we are always available. Wait, let me say, we're not always available. We are not available in the fall as much as we are now. So we're happy to answer any questions and meet with you anytime. So I just wanted to close with this quote from Jenny Rickard, who is the president and CEO of the Common Application. The prospect of a college education should be filled with possibility, hope, and joy, and so should the experience to get there. Attitude is everything, so start by internalizing that it really, truly is going to work out. I can assure you that is true. The great strength of our higher education system is its incredible diversity. As you embark on this journey, suspend your preconceived notions about what the right school is and open your mind to the countless number of incredible options out there for your student. You'll be amazed at the possibilities, and you'll discover some hope and joy along the way. That would be my hope for you. So now I am very, very pleased to introduce our guest, and our friend, Nick Orban. Nick is a special assistant to the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at the University of Maryland. In his role, he assists in the day-to-day operation of the Office of Enrollment Management, which includes the Office of Undergraduate Admission, Office of Student Financial Aid, and Office of the University Registrar. Nick started his professional career in 2013, where he serves on the admission committee and is the admission representative for independent schools in the Baltimore area. So those are the only schools that he oversees. Nick is a double graduate of Maryland. He earned his BA in Government and Politics in 2013 and his master's in Teaching and Learning Policy and Leadership with a focus in Education Policy Studies in 2019. So welcome, Nick, and thank you for joining us this morning. And please come on up here.
So good morning, everybody. Really excited and thankful to have this opportunity to speak with all of you and hopefully shed some light on the college admission process and talk to you about not just how Maryland does things, but just sort of the process in general. In transparency, I've only been at Maryland. I'm pretty sure if you were to take a pint of blood, it would come out a mix of red, white, black, and gold because I've been on campus for 15 years. So while I don't know necessarily immediately how things will work at other schools, I've been thankful enough to know many great colleagues like Andy Savasco from Loyola, who Ms. Ross talked about earlier, and so I've gotten an idea of just the general landscape of college admission, how things work. So if there are questions or just want to talk about how things will generally work across the board or how different situations might change depending on different schools, happy to kind of talk through those different hypotheticals. Ms. Ross had sent me a list of things to kind of cover or sort of questions at least to kind of go through. I don't know how you just want to kind of like fly through the list and see where we go. What do you think?
We'll be open for questions.
Absolutely. So one of the big things that at least we've talked about before, or sort of as we've prepared for working with students, is the sort of landscape as it relates to standardized testing. Pre-COVID, most colleges across the country required either the SAT or ACT. But in the spring and summer of 2020, testing centers were closing. Students legitimately could not find an opportunity to take a standardized test, whether it was the SAT or ACT. And so the universities and colleges across the United States, in almost all cases, moved to a position where they began reviewing applications test optional, where students could opt in or opt out to whether or not they wanted to include standardized test scores in their applications. Many colleges, Maryland included, are using this opportunity to really, look and consider a reset in our admission process to whether or not we should include standardized test scores in our admission policy. And so what many colleges like Maryland are doing is we are doing sort of short longitudinal study to understand the impacts of what a test optional admission process looks like. So Maryland adopted a test optional admission process in the summer of 2024. Applicants who started at Maryland in fall 21, so the graduating high school class of 21. And we announced that we would do at least 4-year test optional pilot. And so what we're doing at Maryland is looking and assessing, are there differences that we can detect between students who include test scores and students who apply test optional in their admission review process? And this is, for us, is ranging from, I think, some of the traditional pointed to factors like student success, GPA, how many credits are students earning, graduation and success rates. But we're also looking at some other key indicators across the university to understand not just how it's affecting student success from an academic perspective, but also how it's affecting student success from a social perspective, how it's impacting our campus community in a wide variety of different ways. This week has been especially noteworthy because a couple of prominent colleges have announced updates to their test optional process. Yale has gone back to requiring test scores, but they're allowing the inclusion of AP and IB as part of their test score submissions. And Michigan announced that they were going to go more permanently in the test optional route, where they would where their current process, at least in the short term, is not going to require standardized testing to be included. Those kind of two examples of two pretty prominent colleges in our country, I think, kind of illustrate how this is going to work, in my opinion. I've joked for a long time that the blessing and curse of our world, those of us who work in college admissions, is that there are 4,000 colleges across the United States, and they're all great and wonderful. The curse of that is that there are 4,000 colleges, and there are 4,000 different ways that colleges are going to approach things. And that has ranged historically from just what applications are used, application deadlines, and so on. But now standardized testing, I think, is extending into that as well, where different colleges are going to approach this conversation of whether or not test scores should be included or required. The University of California system announced 3-4 years ago, that they're going to go permanently test blind, where students don't even have the option to include it. They're just straight up not going to consider SAT or ACTs. So this is really going to be, I think, an institutional decision of how standardized testing is going to impact or how colleges are going to view standardized testing. When it at least actually comes to the admissions office and when we're reading applications and making admission decisions, I often get a lot of questions about how we review applications with test optional. How can you review applicants the same way if you have one applicant who has a test score and one applicant who doesn't? So the answer to that question, which I'm going to try and paint a little broadly, is many colleges across the country, Maryland included, utilize or practice what's called a holistic admission review process. And that means it's not a formula. It's not a rubric or a series of checkboxes, but it's an evaluation of a student's whole application, looking at a wide array of different factors to help us get a better idea of who that person is. What would that person bring to our institution, their potentials for academic and social success, all different kinds of different things. At Maryland, to use us as an example, we utilize 24 different admission factors that we consider as part of our admission review process, of which one of those factors is SAT or ACT scores. And so if a student opts not to include them, that's great. I have as many as 23 other things that I can consider and think about and look into their application to decide whether or not I think a student is a good fit for the institution or for the university. And so for us, it's never been, in the last 3-4 years, it's never been a problem for us of whether or not a student does or does not include standardized test scores. It's truly up to the student what they think is best for their application. And from there, we still have lots of information to help us go through that application, make a decision of whether or not we think a student is a good fit for our university. All right, I've just rambled a lot on standardized testing. Before I kind of shift gears into different topics and conversations, do you guys have questions or things that you guys really want to think about from a standardized testing or test optional perspective?
Question.
Yeah?
Do you mind sharing the list of the 24?
Is it a cop-out to say that they're on our website? So I will be perfectly honest, I do not have them committed to memory. in part just because of the way our review process is structured, and as we read different application documents, so things like, as we read things like letters of recommendation from a teacher or from a college counselor, or whether as we look through the high school transcript, there are different kind of focal points or pieces that we pick up on through the application that help contribute to those 24 total factors. To give you like a little bit more context, about a third of the factors are academic in nature. And so, for example, when we're looking at a transcript, 3 factors that we're really considering there are level of academic performance, so what kinds of grades has a student earned through high school. We're also looking at the level of rigor in a student's course selection. So what kinds of courses have they taken through high school? Have they challenged themselves academically in the context of their environment? Have they prepared themselves for the rigors of college classes? The last thing that we're looking for in a transcript are trends. So what sort of changes do we see year over year within a transcript? And that can relate to performance, it can relate to rigor, it can relate to the relationship between those two pieces. And so when we're going, like I use transcripts as an example because as you look at our admission factors, GPA is not one of them. When we're going through the process, we're looking at those 3 bigger pieces and larger scale pieces of performance, rigor, and trends to help us understand a student's performance or student's potential for academic success when they come to campus. So I promise I'm not trying to cop out. All 24 factors are listed on our admission website, as they should be for most colleges and universities, to be perfectly honest with you. As you go through and you are working with your sons to think about what schools he may want to apply to, what schools he may be a good fit for, as well as you get to kind of the final stages of building and developing the applications and the essays and written components and so on. I think it's important to consider the admission factors and the admission philosophy that a school will offer. And again, both of those pieces should be on the admissions website. Again, blessing and curse of 4,000 different colleges is that each college is going to approach the admission process differently. We all have different sets of what we broadly call institutional priorities. And so when we're looking at applications, we all have different pieces that we're going to emphasize. So for example, Maryland, as a public school in Maryland, as a school that receives public funding from the state of Maryland, we have a priority and a commitment to serving students from Maryland. By state law, 70% of our undergrads have to be Maryland residents. And in practice, it's 76.5 right now, give or take. So as we're going through the admission process, one of the things that we are considering as we are building and shaping a freshman class is asking ourselves, are we making sure that we're meeting the right number of students from Maryland to continue fulfilling our commitment as a public institution? Now, obviously, we'll pick on a school that we talked about earlier, UNC. It's not going to have as much of a commitment to Maryland residents. They're going to be much more committed to North Carolina residents. And their ratio is not 70-30. Off the top of my head, I think it's like 85-15 or something. I went to high school in North Carolina, so I have like slightly more familiarity. Like NC State is something like 90-10. So they have their own different sets of institutional priorities. And I'm picking on public schools, independent schools, private colleges and universities also have their own sets of different things. So these kinds of institutional priorities are often what's going to inform their admission and review process. Sometimes that might mean they want to grow certain major programs. It might mean that they are looking to fulfill athletic programs. Like it can be a whole host of different pieces that help to support those institutional priorities. Other questions? Sir? Yeah. So the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase and shorten a little bit. So the question was asking about how do students from independent schools fare in the admission process? There are sort of reports that students from independent schools often are not faring as well in the admission process and are not as successful in the selective admission process. And I don't know if that's Maryland specific or kind of across the board. So a couple of things that I will raise there. So the first is a part of, sort of my job or my role and the role of anybody who comes to visit Gilman or any of the other independent schools. Part of our job is to be the expert for Gilman in our admissions office. So different schools will structure their admission process and their review process differently. Some schools will actually have the person who comes to visit Gilman in the fall will be the person who reads Gilman's applications in the fall and winter and helps to make those admission decisions. Maryland is structured differently, where we have a committee of 40 to 45 people, and so multiple people will read multiple applications, but it's not necessarily going to be tied to the person who's that territory representative. So I may not be the person who reads Gilman. By a random chance, I might end up getting Roland Park. It just kind of rotates out and sort of is randomized in a way. Part of my job, though, is when a colleague of mine is reading an application from Gilman, if they have questions and say, hey, what does like a typical admitted student from Gilman look like? Or does Gilman offer honors and AP classes? Different kind of things like that. That's part of my job, to be the expert and then to transfer that information over to help set that context for our committee readers who are reading applications from the different schools. In the same way that, I know very little about, Connolly School for the Holy Child in Bethesda, Potomac. So I would then go to my colleague Sophia, who is the territory rep there, and if I'm reading apps from Holy Child, I can go to ask Sophia those same kinds of questions. I say all of that to say, to answer the question about independent schools, part of our role is to understand what goes on in different independent schools and understand that every school across the United States is different. And our job is to understand the ins and outs of each individual high school to make sure that students are getting reviewed equitably and fairly in the admission process. The second side of the answer that I will also give, I think there's a general reporting out of students from independent schools who are having a harder time with selective admission or admission to Maryland. I also hear about students from Maryland having a difficult time getting in admission to Maryland. The University of Maryland has simply gotten a bit more selective over the last 5 to 10 years. And debatably, much more selective in the last 20 to 30 years. And that's, I think, a reflection of the position Maryland is in as an institution, where we're now a top 25, top 20 public university, where we have a top 10 computer science program and a top 10 engineering program, where there's greater student interest in the university, but we're still limited as an institution to say we can only have about 4,800 freshmen each fall, even though our application numbers have doubled in the last 6 years. So it's changed some of the admission process for students, and I think changed some of the selection and the criteria that we're typically looking for in an average admitted student. And that's a growing change just in the admission process in general. This year, we're going to top 60,000 total applications for admission. When I first started in 2013, I think that year we had 25,000. So it's there's some pretty dramatic changes going on. Part of that is national impact. During COVID, during test optional, I think there was a greater sense of uncertainty or less sort of clarity in the admission process because admission processes were changing. And so students ended up applying to more and more colleges over COVID. I would look to the college counselors to answer this question, but my interpretation is that sort of like average number of applications a student submits has kind of fallen back down since COVID, because I think things have kind of leveled off and stabilized a bit in the admissions world. But that rising number of applications also, I think, is changing how colleges are able to review and make admission decisions. There's a lot of analysis, planning, data assessment that we do on the back end to try to understand student behavior. And I will always joke, our jobs rely on predicting the behavior of 17-year-olds. So like, we're not always going to get it right. But that's where I think sometimes that added component of selectivity comes in, and where the landscape for both Maryland and nationally, I think, is changing. And a lot of that's just driven by student behavior. I mean, it turns into a supply and demand problem at the end of the day, where we have a greater number of students who sometimes literally are demanding to get into Maryland, where we only have a supply of, like I said, 4,800 seats to start in August. Again, that was a lot of rambling. Does that help to answer and add some context? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, when we get Common App, are we able to see the students' application behavior or whether they've applied to other colleges? No. We only get it to our side. We don't. In what you're kind of touching on a little bit is sort of this concept of demonstrated interest. So where students may be applying to different schools with different levels of interest, where there are some students who may be applying to Maryland who may be amazing academic students and say, Maryland is a backup for me, and I'm swinging for the fences for some really great schools. And there are other students who might say, Maryland is the best place in the world, and I would be inclined to agree with them. And they would, and so Maryland is my number one choice, and that's where I want to go. At Maryland, we don't consider that. At other institutions across the country, they do. There are colleges out there who will consider how many times you've emailed, or the content of your emails to the admission office. There are schools who will track when a college rep came to Gilman and did a visit and presentation in the fall. Did your student attend that visit? Did we see your student at the Ames College Fair that's happening in April? Did your student come to campus for a campus tour? Have they done an interview? There are schools that do track these pieces, and that does feed into the admission process for those schools. I'm sorry? Correct. So at Maryland, it doesn't. And the way I sort of explain that is, there are two reasons why we don't. So on the one, again, we're going to clip 60,000 applications this year. That's just a lot of data. That's hard to keep track of at a certain point. And the other reason, to be quite genuine, is for us, I think Maryland is always going to be an institution that's very equity-minded. And so we are very hesitant to put in place different things like tracking demonstrated interest for fear of negatively impacting other students. We have a national and international applicant pool. It's very hard to, assume that a student from Seattle is going to come visit campus and right? There are just kind of different pieces that go into our process that make us think whether or not things like tracking demonstrated interest would work and would make sense for us. And so our general perspective there is we don't track the demonstrated interest piece. It doesn't factor into the admission process, and it will at other schools. And different schools will utilize that and have that be a significant part of their process. And again, there's some back-end pieces and data and assessment we could talk about. And that's right now I'm trying to have an admissions 101 session. That back-end stuff is master's level. So we can get there if we want. But yeah, it's just, again, how different schools will approach the process. A question that Ms. Ross asked me, do we look at self-reported AP scores? Generally, no. So as students go through and complete the Common App, one of the sections that they will complete is about standardized testing, where students can self-report SAT or ACT scores. They can also report AP exams as well. At Maryland, generally, we don't. In our side of the process, we're going to more pay attention to the courses a student has taken. So we'd like to see that students have taken AP courses in high school. That exam score credit conversation is something we more have after a student is admitted and after they enroll at our school, where we request those official scores to get sent in to get awarded for freshman level, whatever, European history, I don't know. So again, that's something that we don't track in admissions or sort of consider in admissions, but something that we more have the conversation around this time and into the summer with our admitted and enrolling students. Okay, so a question that Ms. Ross sent me. Sophomores are just now signing up for their junior year courses. What advice do you have in their course selection? Gilman doesn't have AP and honors tracks in the humanities. How do students compare to students from high schools with larger AP selection? Okay, so let's cover a couple of different things. In terms of course selection, my advice is to try to find and strike the balance between challenging a student and taking a rigorous course schedule, but making sure that course schedule is appropriately challenging. The last thing I want to do is encourage students to go take 4 AP classes if that's going to be too much of a burden, and if that's something that's where a student is overall not going to perform as well in their coursework. Because again, we're looking at that balance of rigor and performance in our admission review. And so we want to make sure that students are challenging themselves, but challenging themselves appropriately is I think, that needle I would encourage threading. no idea how helpful that is. In terms of the second piece of being fewer AP classes in the humanities track and how do we compare that to other schools, that's again where sort of that larger conversation of individual high school takes a role in the admission process. That context of the individual academic environment is one of the things that we really pride ourselves on, of considering each student within their own academic environment. It is unfair to assume that a student is going to take 4 AP history classes at Gilman if Gilman only offers 2, right? Like, that's just not a fair expectation for students. And so that's where understanding the school, working with the counselors, knowing about course offerings and so on, that's where we really jump in for that context that helps us understand what's available to a student and how they challenge themselves, again, within that academic environment. Questions? Sir. So to restate the question or repeat it for the recording side, as we talked about, there are fewer AP courses available at Gilman in the humanities side. What happens if a student still takes an AP exam in those areas, even if they didn't take the AP course? Like, how can students report that to colleges? How can that be something that colleges are considered? Because, as I mentioned earlier, Maryland does not really consider the AP scores. So there are a couple things, and I realize one of the things I'm about to say may sound contradictory, so I'm going to clarify it too. As we talked about, there is the self-reported test score section. And so students can report that information. I said earlier, we're not really necessarily going to consider the scores. Students can still list it and we still see it. It's not like it gets blocked out in our view of the application. And so if students list that information on the application, then, as we're rolling through, we can see that information. What we're not necessarily looking for is to say, okay, Jimmy got a 5 in AP Environmental Science, and he got a 4 in AP Economics, and got a 5 in AP Calculus BC. Those are things that we're looking for. That's not how our process is working, because we're not necessarily focusing on the scores. The other way that students could consider including that information in the application, or I've got 2 sort of alternate options. So the first is, in Common App, there is a section, they've changed the wording over time, but it's basically, paraphrasing the prompt, it says something like, if you wanted to discuss something but feel you haven't been able to do so in the rest of the application, feel free to do so here. So students could list that there. It's a fairly open-ended text box. The other option to consider would be working with the college counselor who's going to write your son's letter of recommendation to colleges, and they can also include that. Part of the counselor letter of recommendation is to give us a little bit more academic background information at a higher level about the student, and so that kind of could fit in nicely within the letter of recommendation there too. The second part of your question was sort of a little bit more broadly of how would this work at other colleges? I think generally I would say the same kind of stuff across the board, like the sort of those different kind of strategies I talked about, I think would be useful across the board for different colleges, not necessarily just Maryland. So to restate the question first, the question asked sort of, so there are students who have friends at public schools who are already taking 4 AP courses as a sophomore and are going to take more as a junior and more as a senior. Meanwhile, at Gilman, students are limited to only taking 2 AP courses as a junior. How do colleges appropriately compare these 2 students, and how do colleges sort of make those decisions of who gets in? The first thing that I will mention is colleges are never comparing 2 applications side by side. Like, there are simplified exercises we'll go through, so like the case study that Ms. Ross talked about that you guys are going to have the option to participate in January. In that case, in that situation, it's very simplified, where you might get 4 or 5 applications, and we say, okay, you get to choose 2 of them that you want to admit. That's not how it actually works. Like, we do that as a simplification to help you guys get you in the mindset, but it's in our processes, we're reading each application individually. We are taking 1 student at a time, spending the appropriate time with that student's application, looking at everything that student in particular has to offer, and asking ourselves, is this student a good fit for the university? Part of that conversation is academic context and understanding that, yes, if this student had gone to Towson High School instead of Gilman School, this student could have had more AP courses. But that's sort of a what if argument, and that's not necessarily the way we're framing it. We're framing it, again, within the context of a student's academic environment. Have they challenged themselves appropriately within Gilman? And so we're not necessarily trying to pick and choose different pieces or sort of transpose this student to a different school and sort of ask ourselves the what if. I'm going to steal a line from a friend of ours, the deputy director at Johns Hopkins. His name is Calvin Wise, and he and I have done panels and presentations together over the years. And he has always emphasized that at Hopkins, and I would argue at Maryland as well, the admission process is evidence-based. It's based on what's included within your application. We can use that information to sort of predict or forecast how we think a student might behave and succeed on campus, but we're not going to use it to say, think about how a student might behave at a different high school or how their high school journey may have differed. It's all individualized, and it's all within, to that end, it's all individualized within that student's environment and context. Yeah. So the question was sort of going back to this public school versus private school conversation. If a student at a typical public school may have 50, or a top student in a public school may have 15 AP classes, but the top student at Gilman might only have 5 by the time they graduate, how does that sort of compare? And so, same kind of thing. We're only thinking about this student in their context and their environment. Like, so when your son applies to colleges, we have no idea. We know that he goes to Gilman. We know that Gilman is an independent school, but we have no idea what high school he would be districted to otherwise. So again, in the same vein, it's not necessarily fair of us to think about, what if your son went to River Hill instead, right? And like, it's all going to stay within the world of Gilman and understanding the context of Gilman. So the point was sort of coming back to earlier conversations we've had about the admission process and the selective process and how students might stack up against one another. The counterpoint I might make is, if students from independent schools and independent schools are reporting that sort of admissions is becoming more selective, that same conversation is happening in public schools too. Like, we're not, admit rates are not benchmarked or targeted, or we don't have individual quotas or ratios or whatever. I would, if we went back and went through the data, I would say admit rates at independent schools would have probably changed in the exact same way admit rates have changed in public schools. And so it's just sort of the world that you guys live in. And that's not meant to be a criticism at all. Like, you have your communities, and that's fantastic, and that's the people who you hear from, and you have friends and family friends who have older children and older siblings who went through this process, and so you're hearing it from them, and that makes total sense. I would just venture to say the same conversations are happening in the public school world too. So the question was about sort of, how do you coach or sort of work with students who are at different points between sort of understanding exactly what they're interested in and having, I don't know if you call it motivation or focuses, versus the students who are still finding themselves and have a wider array of interests. I would honestly, 1,000,000% encourage that student with varying interests to continue having varying interests. There are so many programs at my college who love having students with diverse academic interests. And part of that stems from the fact that we have a broad general education program where students are not taking 120 credits of computer science. Sidebar, that sounds terrible. Where students are taking, like, more than a third of their degree program is going to be general education, where they are going to be taking courses all across the university. For students who have motivations, who know, for example, from age 7 that they wanted to be a lawyer, great. You know exactly what you want, you can focus on it, and you can push forward in that route. But for students who have diverse academic interests, like, that's still wonderful, and I would never discourage that student from doing anything differently. My biggest advice or coach would be, find ways to sort of amplify it or continue discovering your path, because that path of success will come to you soon. Yes, ma'am. The question was, do I have admissions data from the last 3 to 5 years about Gilman specific, how many students applied, how many were admitted? The short answer is yes, comma, somewhere. I have it somewhere in my laptop, which is in my car, but and I might lean on the college counselors to back me up a little. I would say in a typical year, 50 to 75 applicants from Gilman. In a typical year, more than half are getting admitted. And in a typical year, 5 to 10 will enroll, give or take. I mean, and there's variance across the board. Coming back again to other conversations we've had this morning, I think colleges recognize that Gilman students are very strong students, that Gilman as a whole is a very strong school. And I think that's representative in admission processes across the board, where students are typically able to have high levels of success as they go through the admission process, where they present strong college applications because they're getting a great education at Gilman. I think one of the things that is always remarkable on my side is I'm looking through the different lists of different schools that I work with. Gilman probably has one of the best success rates of invitations to our honors college, which is our top academic program at the university. About a quarter of our freshman class will be students in the honors college, maybe closer to 20%. And so the honors college works to identify the top academic students in our applicant pool and invite them to this smaller, more tight-knit living and learning community. And so that, to me, especially as we're working with Gilman students, is one of the things that always jumps out and looking at rosters, is that there's typically a pretty solid chunk that are getting invited to the honors college. I don't know, Ms. Ross, do you have anything to add to that too, or? No? Okay. So to restate the question first, could we talk about how major plays a role in the admission process, whether or not a major and its popularity maybe will negatively impact a student's application? Did I grab everything? Was there? Yeah. Okay. So again, this is going to be one of those 4,000 flavors of Baskin-Robbins college admissions, where it's going to vary depending on each individual school. At some schools, yes, major will play a role in that selection process because that's how they manage their enrollment. Each major has a capacity, and so they are admitting students directly to majors. Other colleges don't even let you declare a major until the end of your sophomore year. I think UNC is a prominent example of that. Maryland specific, we read applications major agnostic. We see it on the application. We see a student's intended major. That can sometimes help us to understand a student's interests. If a student is interested in computer science, it's probably not going to be a surprise that he's done coding camps or that he built his own custom PC or whatever. It helps us add context to some of the other non-academic pieces within the application. But the fact that he's interested in computer science, right now our most popular major, not a negative. It's not going to negatively affect his application. Our job in admissions is to admit a student to the university as a whole. Now, if a student is interested in a particular program at Maryland that is more popular than others, we have a suite of majors that we call limited enrollment programs, or LEPs. And so these are programs that are the most popular. They often end up being the most prestigious majors that we have at the university. And so in an effort to keep class sizes small, to maintain class quality, and to make sure that students are able to graduate in 4 years, the university puts caps in the enrollment in each of these majors. Some of these majors are going to include computer science, engineering, the Robert H. Smith School of Business, biological sciences, chemistry, biochemistry. Those are the big heavy hitters. If a student is interested in one of those programs, they first come to us in admissions, and again, we're reading it major agnostic. We're just deciding whether or not we want to admit a student to the university as a whole. And if we say yes to that question, then that student's application is going to be sent for review by the academic department or academic college. And then they're making that determination of saying, okay, in the A. James Clark School of Engineering, we have a freshman enrollment cap of 700 students. Is this a student we want to include among that 700? If they say yes, great. Goes out in the admission letter, everything's wonderful. If a student's not directly admitted to their major of choice, they're still admitted to the university because we said so in admissions. That's still a student that we want to have on our campus. They will be admitted instead to our Letters and Sciences program. That's our program for undeclared or undecided students. And then students will get tailored advising to help find their path on campus. In most cases, they can still enter their major of choice. So for a student who wants engineering, they basically have to take the freshman engineering course load. and I kind of describe it to students as like you're proving yourself to the department to say, hey, I can hang, I did the work, let me in. And in most cases, it's non-competitive. They complete the work, they fill out an application, which is basically a form, and then 10 days later, they're in the major. 2 exceptions to that rule are computer science and business. So computer science this year, for the very first time, is no longer having that non-competitive process. It's going to, in fact, become highly, highly selective. Computer science, despite being a limited enrollment program for the last 5 years, turns out being a limited enrollment program did not, in fact, limit their enrollment. They grew by 50% in the last 6 years. And so what they are now doing is so they are going to slowly grow the number of freshman admits that they have, and they're going to severely limit the number of what we call internal transfers. So students who are current Maryland students moving into the major. So that's going to be highly selective, and we try to be very transparent with students about this. This year, for example, we released admission decisions on a Friday. That Saturday, students got an email with additional information on what this process looks like. The other exception to the non-competitive piece is business. They are not as selective as the computer science program. If students have like a 3.7, they're guaranteed admission into the Smith School. And otherwise, students are typically competitive around a 3.3 or a 3.4 with their college work. That's complicated. I oversimplified it. That was my job for 4 years. If there are other questions about that specifically, I'm happy to talk about it. But at least that's how major plays in the admission process. So to restate the question, in our admission process, we're using a lot of sort of information about the high school and their potential for academic success. As we go through and sort of retinker with our admission process, how do we factor in things like student success when they're on campus, success after they graduate from Maryland and they're on into their careers, or grad school or whatever? The short answer is we don't. Our admission process is largely driven by the academic affairs of the institution. We fall under the academic wing of the university. So there is some general assessment of some student success measures, primarily graduation rate and student retention rate. So how many students are returning for year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. But the consideration of things like career success and average salary, grad school placement, and so on, that admittedly, those conversations are absolutely happening, and those are something that those are things that the university is very keen and interested in and invested in, but those are not necessarily going to inform the admission process. The admission process for us is much more about the high school student, knowing that there are lots of different tracks that go on, that students go on after they graduate from the institution. There are probably some schools who do track, there are probably some colleges who track things like student retention and graduation rate by their origin high school, and that may play a role in some colleges' admission processes. Again, it's just a lot of data and not anything that we play with. So the question was, what is the role of extracurricular activities like sports or music or clubs in high school, and how does that play a role in the admission process? Is that, yeah? That's something we're quite interested in. So one of the components of the Common App is going to ask students to include a list of their extracurricular activities. So they can list, Common App limits you to 10, or has an upward limit of 10 activities that students can list on their application. Alternatively, students can include a resume instead, depending on what that student's preference is. That still is really useful for us, because that's where some of those non-academic pieces that we're considering, those non-academic factors, are going to help us to understand a student. Because for us, it is more than just whether or not a student can be academically successful at the university. The reality is probably the majority of students in our applicant pool could come to Maryland, be good students, graduate in 4 years. It's where some of those non-academic pieces really come in to help shape and round out a student's review. We don't have specific expectations, like we don't I think there used to be sort of like an expectation or sort of like a practice that students would have one sport, one instrument, and one club that they participated in. They had kind of these three prongs or pillars. Some students still do that, and that's great. But we also understand that students have different academic interests. And I think this actually honestly ties back to a question we had earlier of how do we consider different students who maybe like one student is incredibly focused and knows exactly what he or she wants to do versus another student who is still a little bit more, I don't know if you call it well-rounded or jack of all trades or sort of has a diverse array of interests. These pieces of things like extracurricular activities help us to get a better understanding of who that student is and who they would be and who they might become when they come to our colleges and universities. Learning about a student's interests and how they've chosen to spend their free time in ways that are not Netflix and Disney Plus help us to learn about that student in the admission process and get an idea about the individual qualities that that student may have. And that really helps round out sort of that application. So those extracurricular activities are a big part for us and something that we really talk a lot about, especially as we're in committee, of thinking about how different students have involved themselves outside of the classroom. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much for getting up at the crack of dawn, battling our carpool line.
Before dawn.
Oh, before dawn. And we're just so grateful that you are here and for our partnership. I hope you can leave today feeling confident in the knowledge that, Nick represents one university and one person. You can see the thoughtfulness and the care that goes into this process. And it really is about partnership. It's a partnership with you, with your child, and with these universities who know Gilman extremely well. And we are all seeking the best outcome for every one of our students. Again, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to email me or stop by our office. I'm more than happy to sit down with you. And maybe Nick will stay around for about 5 minutes if you have any other questions. But thank you for being with us this morning, and we look forward to working with your children. Thank you.